to Teresa Christiansen. I was delighted. As I wade through my 81st year, I have given a lot of thought to how we become who we are right now, who influenced us, what situations spoke to us, what did we ingest and what did we discard. Many of us here are photographers who have come to the art and the craft of photography along different routes. Some of us were given a brownie at a young age. Some of us had a parent who made photos. Some of us stumbled into photography working on their high school or college yearbook. Many of us thought of ourselves having emerged from an aesthetically zero family, and that we proceeded to craft ourselves essentially out of nothing but love. Every pursuit has its own vocabulary, whether a plumber, a clergy person, a construction worker, or a farmer. Each has his own language. Teresa Christiansen emerged from a different experience. As the daughter of a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, she grew up in a household that talked art. She absorbed the vocabulary simultaneously with all the other words we ingested. I believe that she learned to think visually. That is a special gift, one that cannot be chosen. It is luck or karma, kismet or serendipity. And so Teresa will tell you about herself and her journey to this point in her personal history. Let's welcome her.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you to the Photo Council and Julia Dolan, Angel O'Brien, and ProPhoto. So, welcome to my favorite time of the year, when all the flowers are out, everyone's sneezing, we all stay up way too late because it's light for so long, and we never go to sleep. I just wanted to ask how many of you consider yourselves photographers here? Wow, a lot, okay. And out of that, how many of you are interested or have pursued landscape photography? Cool, a lot, about the same number almost. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about my current investment in the practice of landscape photography and how I see it related to some historic and also contemporary examples. I also want to discuss the way I see photography in dialogue with other media, specifically painting and sculpture. So I consider myself a photographer. It's my primary medium, but I was trained as a painter, and as Carol was saying, I grew up looking at paintings. So I thought I'd show you some of those that made an impression on me as a young person, and some of my early work, which I have not looked at in a very long time, that led me to where I am now. So my father was a curator of European paintings. We took a lot of trips to Italy, and I spent a lot of moments in really cold chapels in the middle of summer looking at frescoes, like this one by Giotto of St. Francis in Assisi. I have my middle name named after St. Francis, and I remember these frescoes so well, especially the way that the natural world has this fantastical element to it. The rocks are so stylized, they look sort of surreal. I also remember these frescoes by Fra Angelico that are in Florence, in the convent of San Marco. He painted every cell that was inhabited by a monk with a different scene. And the way that he rendered the nature, like the flowers, the super symmetrical trees, those abstract rocks, just had such a magical feeling about it to me. I also looked at a lot of Caravaggio, because my dad was working on an exhibition, and I loved the details of realism that made the figures so believable. And I was really struck with how Caravaggio used light and gesture to stop time, sort of like a photograph. In college, I studied in Florence, and I went back to see these different works of art. And it really had this resonation in my head as I reconnected with them. I was studying painting and psychology in college, I continued painting. I had taken all the photo classes that were offered at the liberal arts college I went to. And when I moved in the early 2000s to Red Hook, Brooklyn, I was really fascinated with the urban landscape there, so I painted it. Red Hook, if you don't know about that neighborhood, it was one of the earliest areas in Brooklyn to be settled, and it had a really prominent shipping and port area that declined quite a lot. As the city developed, it was cut off from the subway system by the Gowanus Canal and Expressway, and it's only accessible by one very, very slow bus line. It's home to the largest housing project in Brooklyn, and I was really drawn to these abandoned relics from the Red Hook port industry, warehouses that had no windows, boarded up doors, crumbling waterfronts, and I would make my paintings off of photographs that I took. I wandered around with my camera. And at some point, I started to consider the photo the final form rather than the painting. I started to shoot with a medium format film camera, working to make sea prints in a dark room in the evenings. Red Hook was undergoing this transformation with plans for an IKEA to open on the waterfront. This is the site of the future IKEA that opened in 2008. And my photographs started to shift to show these industrial relics that would be torn down, places where nature had started to invade. And at this point, I started graduate school. And while I was in graduate school, I saw a few shows that really impacted me and sort of stuck in my brain. One is a retrospective about on Gerhard Richter's work. It was at MoMA, and I went to see it with my dad, and I was really taken aback at the conversation between painting and photography that his work provoked for me. He has these photorealistic paintings, and the way they hover between representation and abstraction was really fascinating. I also saw the 2007 Jeff Wall retrospective at the MoMA, and this is an image that was bought by the Metropolitan Museum while I was working there. I documented this installation, and I saw Jeff Wall speak. I think that this show was one of the first contemporary photo shows that my dad and I saw together, and we had a lot to talk about because Jeff Wall references historical paintings really specifically and other works of art in his work, and he's really all about this dialogue with other media through photography. And that to me was something that was really new, that a lot of contemporary artists are doing now, but it definitely struck me. He treats photographs as large-scale narrative paintings, and he builds these backlit photo transparency boxes that take on a physical form and become something really different than just a photograph. I went to see this show a lot of times. When I moved to Portland in 2010, I started a series where I explored very directly the connections between photography and painting by painting with gouache on top of large inkjet prints. Often painting and photography are discussed in opposition to one another. Stephen Shore talks about this in his book, The Nature of Photographs, where a painter starts with a blank canvas and builds a picture. A photographer starts with the messiness of the world and selects a picture. And in my practice, I've always been interested in challenging this opposition, working with bits and pieces of what I find in the world and photograph, and then bringing it into my studio to create it and turn it into something else. Painting onto prints like I did here, but as you'll see in newer work, using my hand in different ways, through cutting, weaving, merging prints with objects and textures. When I moved to Portland, I started working at PNCA, where I still am now. I'm a faculty member there. And I was tasked at the time with building out their inkjet print lab, which some of you are very familiar with, our digital print studio. At the time, it only had a few printers, and it was just for photo students, so I expanded it to be available to all majors. And I saw so many students doing such cool things with these printers that it really inspired me, and I had access to them all day. So I started to have fun printing out images and bringing them into my studio. I started to experiment with how rephotographing a printed photo can create a really intriguing effect. So this is from a little series I called There Now, where I took photos of my feet standing on top of large-scale inkjet prints. And it was a nod to the tendency for people to photograph their feet in places and then post it to social media as sort of proof, like, I'm here, this is me. Except that I wasn't there, I was just standing on a photo. I was grappling with how I could use the printed photograph in the studio to raise questions around the illusion of photography and the tendency for it to be viewed as this window onto a world. So that work led me to a series that I called Real Artifice, in which I continued the process of photographing inkjet prints in the studio. And for this series, I wanted to work with the genre of still life and pull specifically from the tradition of still life painting as a way to engage that dialogue between painting and photography further. I was fascinated with the way that still life had been present through much of art history in serving as a way to depict and describe objects while at the same time critique them. So Dutch and Flemish still life painting in the 17th century would show off the skills of artists and would also have this implied symbolic meaning in the objects in the paintings that were meant for the viewer to meditate on their own mortality. I played around with a lot of different references in my studio. Here was one exercise in working with cutout inkjet prints of photos of a skull that I arranged so the skull was seen from multiple angles at the same time, a similar challenge that Cubist painters took on. And in photography, still life as a genre has been really dominated by advertising. So I wanted to play with the blurred boundary between art and advertising that photography often treads, while positioning objects that are expected to be seen in a still life, like fruit, flowers, plants, against colorful backdrops. I wanted to encourage folks to wonder why they were looking at these things, to have fun with sort of the absurdity of the image, and then to piece apart my process. For me, it was less about the symbolic meaning, making me think about mortality, but more about poking fun at their formulaic use within the genre. And I was hoping to activate a conversation around what's fake and real in each image. So here, there are these like plastic apples that are fake next to prints of the photos of the apples. Apples and apples. So if you look at this, you think, is that a real violin? And then you think, okay, so it's a photo of a print of a photo of a violin, which sort of begs the question, is that any more or less real? And like, so what? I was drawing attention to our tendency to view photography, as I said, as this window onto the world, a medium that delivers an accurate representation of what's in front of the camera. And I was hoping for a moment to disrupt in a viewer long enough for them to start to question what they were actually looking at and how I might have made it. So that assumption that photography is this window represses this examination of process, I think, a lot of the time. When we look at a painting, we assume that every brush stroke is intentional, so we spend time admiring the choices made in the texture or the color. But with a photograph, there's this magical sense that everything we see just was. But if you spend time with an image like this, it will reveal that things are sort of off. The shadows, it's blown out on the projector, but the shadows are going in opposite directions from these plants. And they kind of look the same. So if you spend time with it, you'll start to understand that I photographed a fake plastic plant on an inkjet background that I'd drawn on my iPad with Procreate. I printed it out, and then I used that as a background and positioned the plant again on top of it. And the blue tape hopefully is a reference to working in the studio and putting everything together. Other images in this series are more direct. They take a little less time to figure out how they were made. Instead, they sort of serve more as rhymes or playful nudges. I found that vivid color was a useful tool to suggest playfulness, while also referring to advertising language at the moment. And each photo often leads to the next in my practice. So as I worked with this series, it started to evolve to deal more with references to landscape. And I started to work with images that weren't inkjet prints of photos I'd made, but were found examples of representations of landscape. like this pocket-sized souvenir print of a French waterfall that my old photo teacher gave to me. I found myself fascinated with the idea of landscape as a commodity, marketed for consumption, appearing across so many different contexts. And I started to source images from NASA's website, from Google, thinking about how images that represent something we've never seen, like the pyramids I've never seen, but they are so familiar and so known to us. I set for myself the challenge of how to depict a landscape through the genre of still life, which carried me into my next series of work. In this series, Natural Selections, I played with a lot of the same variables that I used in Real Artifice, but here the main object of study for the still life is a large photographic print of a landscape that I had photographed. And then I placed related objects within it that kind of fail miserably to integrate into a believable scene, like these chunks of moss that I stuck in little tears, or these trees for a model train set. This piece I titled Punctum, which is, of course, a nod to Roland Barthes' use of the term in Camera Lucida. He says, quote, "A photograph's punctum is that accident which pricks me, but also bruises me, is poignant to me." And it literally refers to the nail piercing the inkjet print of the tree bark, interrupting the illusion of the photo's transparency. Which to me is the punctum that I'm always chasing with my work. That moment when someone looks at it and says, "Oh, I see what's been done here." So I'm curious how many of you here have learned photography through analog or darkroom processes? A lot, okay. That was my experience as well. I learned photography through the darkroom in high school, agitating a tray of developer under red lights, right? Waiting for an image to emerge. And my first job out of college was making prints in the black and white darkroom of the photograph studio at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where I made contact prints from 8x10 negatives that they were still shooting at the time of the art in the museum. And it was really interesting working in that environment in the beginning of the 2000s because I saw the whole studio evolve into digital processes. We got to test some of the first medium format digital camera backs. We scanned all the negatives for their digital archive. And I think because of this movement from like learning photography in an analog context and then bringing it into the beginning of the digital realm, I've always held a really consciously critical view of what it means to make a digital image and work with digital processes. So in an image like this, where I photographed these weird plastic mounds of grass, and then merge them in Photoshop to make the background that they're sitting on, I intentionally left artifacts of my process sort of as an entry point, a way to expose it. And I like revealing my process. Hopefully it becomes a little bit of a game for the viewer to entertain them, to reward them for longer viewing. I've always gravitated towards photographic processes that involve me putting my hand into the work, like ripping paper, setting up objects, weaving these pipe cleaners through the print. And I find these ways to create physical connection to the medium that is then in turn asks the viewer to contemplate my process and sort of ask what was done here. I think this is something that's shared with a lot of artists in my generation and everyone who's learned photography through these analog methods, because there's this desire to interact with the photograph, to bring a magic to it that unveils itself slowly, just like you're in a dark room, right, watching that image appear. Matthew Grant is an artist who made this series Lakes and Reservoirs at around the same time I was working on Natural Selections. He soaks seed prints in the water that he takes from the sources of water that he photographs. So there's this circular act there, and it's a direct reference to this process of working in the darkroom, but it also creates an image that speaks to the physical surface and chemistry of the chromogenic print. And there's this sense that the disintegration of the print almost makes it look like a painting, breaking that photographic illusion. It becomes something other than a photo. Erin O'Keefe creates work that's very much in dialogue with both painting and sculpture. She paints forms in her studio and then photographs them. And the images are these visual puzzles and rhymes. They trick our eye at every turn. The first artist that got me thinking about connections between photography and sculpture was Andy Goldsworthy, whom many know through his site-specific installations, some of which are permanent, like Storm King, where he built a wall, but many of which are really ephemeral, and they're only known through his photography. When I was working as an assistant photographer at the Met in their photo studio, I photographed the roof garden installations, and in 2004, Goldsworthy installed stone houses, and he asked me to shoot him with his own Hasselblad. And he ended up including my images in his book. Spending those days on the roof watching these giant sculptures come together and thinking about how to photograph them had a really profound impact on me. Another artist that contributed to my understanding of potential for dialogue between photography and sculpture is Robert Smithson, an artist who, like many of his contemporaries, such as Ed Ruscha or Dan Graham, used photography as a means to a conceptual end. And in this piece, he created this series of 9 photographs that in their final form were presented with an essay for Artforum magazine. He photographed landscapes where he temporarily installed mirrors, calling the works mirror displacements. And the mirrors reflect their surroundings, but they disrupt the continuity of the landscape. He also worked at a time when American photographers were really challenging the way they saw and pictured the landscape, and he challenged many of the traditions of picturing it, working within the very places that previous photographers had intentionally excluded from their idyllic images of nature. He placed himself in the landscape, selected details, and chose subjective views from within, rather than taking the traditional stance of photographing the landscape from a distance. And in his essay, Art to the Camera's Eye, he defined this in terms of an open versus closed landscape. He explained that an artist who operates within a closed landscape bases their point of view on intentional boundaries, defining a, quote, self-sustaining autonomous limit within a contained framework. On the other hand, the open landscape, quote, embodies multiple views, some of which are contradictory, whose purpose is to reveal a clash of angles and orders within a sense of simultaneity. This shatters any predictable frame of reference. So I use these ideas as a jumping point for my next series of work, In Different Horizons, which was a show that I exhibited at Melanie Flood Projects in 2016. I asked myself how I could attempt to use my photographic practice to create open landscapes and engage with a lot of these ideas that Smithson's work ignited for me. And for some of them, I took 2 printed photographs and overlapped them, cutting and ripping edges to reveal one another. I worked with unexpected combinations, challenging preconceptions like Smithson did of what constitutes a landscape. This one's called Monument, the same title Smithson gave his images of industrial structures from the monuments of Passaic. And I didn't re-photograph these prints. They're one-of-a-kind collages. I see them as a sculpture of sorts, calling attention to the physicality of the printed paper through the tears and the carved edges. And the show title, In Different Horizons, and each piece was named after Smithson's writings. This one is called Portable Tomb, which is a term Smithson used to describe the camera. And this piece, De-differentiation, is the same piece made again, but shown from the back, where 2 photos become the same piece of white paper. The feeling of ripping a large inkjet print is really chaotic. It goes against everything you learn about how to handle these precious prints. And that physical act of cutting and tearing traces something forever in the surface of the print in a similar way that a camera records the images around it. In thinking about the physical surface, I also played with the way a photograph is installed and sits in space. So this is an image that was printed on fabric that you could see through. It was silk. And then it was installed in the corner of a gallery, so the light goes through it. I also started to play with pushing the photographic print into a three-dimensional form by literally pushing the print into buckles and folds, and pressing the print up against a piece of frosted plexi. This created an effect that I found similar to the way an image sort of shifts in and out of focus when you're peering at the ground glass of a large format view camera. And there's this simultaneous depth and flatness that's created. As you look at the image, you become aware of your eye trying to create the seamless scene that you're expecting to see. And I wanted there to be this slow reveal in these images, an opportunity for someone to step back and then up close and then back again, experiencing it in a space as they physically move to see it. There was something really satisfying about making photographs that could not be truly appreciated on the screen. And this piece, as well as the first plexi piece I showed, are in the Portland Art Museum collection. They were part of a show that Julia Dolan curated in 2017 called Photography and Contemporary Experience. And adjacent to one of my pieces was Horizon Mother by Ben Buswell, also a Portland-based artist who works across media, often interrupting the surface of the photographic prints by actions like this, where he's cut strips of the photo and lets them sort of pool and hang down the center of the image. A conservator's nightmare, I think. Letha Wilson is another artist I see my work in dialogue with. She creates sculptures out of landscape photographs that she's taken herself. This photo's mounted onto cement and curled over. And she talks about this sculptural intervention being an attempt to compensate for the photograph's failure to encompass the physical site that it represents. She came to PNCA in 2017 as an artist in residence, and she took photographs here that she then turned into this installation. In the lecture that she gave, she described approaching the genre of landscape photography with equal parts reverence and skepticism. In the next series of work I made, I embraced a playfulness with my images. I turned to a really vivid color palette again, working with decorative patterns. I called this series Beauty Spots after a term that David Bate uses in his writing on landscape photography to refer to a picturesque destination that a tourist would go to, a pre-constituted view. And I'm really fascinated by the compulsion that so many of us have to photograph these beauty spots once we're there, even though we've already experienced them most likely on social media, through other photographs. So think of Multnomah Falls, right? You get out of your car, you see this beautiful waterfall, you have to take a photo of it, even though on the drive there, you've already seen this grid of the exact same photos on Instagram, and you know that the photo you take is gonna look very much like those. Teju Cole wrote a piece for the New York Times in 2018 for their On Photography column called Take a Photo Here, where he unpacks this phenomenon of people not only taking photographs of the same sites, but of the same sites in the same way, from the same vantage point and compositions, as though everyone were subject to the same set of instructions. I often assign this reading to my students, some of you will remember it, and then ask them to search Instagram for famous landscape sites and see if this holds true, if they can find instances of the same photo taken from the same location. Teju Cole then goes on to talk about how such sites like the Roman Forum, in his example, actually do direct tourists to specific viewpoints to make their images from. Not only are we inclined toward the picturesque in our image compositions, and many of us are shooting on the exact same iPhones with the same focal length and the same lens, but there are often these features at sites that work to direct visitors to optimal viewpoints, which he calls affordances. We think we're moving through the world, while the whole time the world is pulling us along, telling us where to walk, where to stop, where to take a photo. The world individually mesmerizes us towards reiteration. And here's what I see as one of the current crises of photography, that we're all constantly recreating one another's images, spinning out Instagram grids of repetition, and my act of rephotographing a photographic print is redundant and circular, and I was hoping that by doing this, I was pointing to these acts of reiteration. My actions to these prints, the cutting, the intervening of other materials, was much more obvious than in past works, and the surface of the prints are interrupted, and in their place are decorative patterns. I played with every way possible that a photograph could be cut, bent, hole punched. And in this piece, Stratum, I took 2 different views of the same field of grass from up on Powell Butte, cut them into strips, and then alternated them. So there's a connection to how a lenticular print works, but the image refuses to ever fully resolve into either one or the other. And for me, this speaks to the failure of a photograph to ever truly represent the experience of space, and it's sort of my futile attempt to incorporate more than one perspective in a single image. My physical interactions are crude at times. I put my process in the forefront. And for me, putting my hand into the work like this, cutting apart the images into imperfect patterns, is kind of a form of drawing. I often think of Tayshu Cole's article when I'm making photographs, and I challenge myself, as well as my students, to actively work against the tendency of reiteration. How can we make images that are original? How can we stop and reframe what we're looking at in a subjective way that takes into account our unique perspective, our specific appreciation of the space? And in this series, as in much of my work, I photograph close-up views of fragments of nature around me. I resist sort of those broad, expansive, sublime views that we're so used to seeing in landscape photography. So to look at one of those, someone that comes to mind is Carlton Watkins, one of the first photographers of Yosemite Valley. His images borrowed modes of depicting landscape that had been used in painting from around the same time, showing it as sublime and awe-invoking, but also picturesque and welcoming, so we could walk down those banks and sit by that lake. The American West was shown by a lot of these photographers as untouched land, a place to visit and explore. And Watkins and other photographers also incorporated evidence of industrial expansion, that a lot of them worked on commission for the railroad or the Geological Survey. So industry appears settled into nature, existing in harmony with the land, standing as symbols of progress. This image was made just 100 miles up the river, up the Columbia River from Portland, and the railroad tracks are photographed in harmony with the land, disappearing into the distance, undisturbing the land around it. The image can almost be read as a metaphor for manifest destiny. And I always find it interesting how approaches to American landscape through photography echo the thoughts and beliefs of the time at which they were made. As nature started to become perceived as threatened, landscape photography sought to show these ideals of wilderness as nature in pristine isolation and in need of preservation. In her book, The Lure of the Local, Lucy Lepard discusses the difficulty that contemporary landscape photography faces as it works against Ansel Adams's, quote, glorious, misleading images of the West. She says that his landscapes have become these emblems of high art, representing an idea of sublime beauty that's clung to, and it's not easily challenged. The Sierra Club still puts out wilderness calendars, this is from 2023, of images that represent scenic places, as though human civilization didn't exist, perpetuating this myth of wilderness as land that's untouched, when in actuality, many of the national parks and wilderness areas that have been created in America as an attempt to preserve and protect land resulted in the forceful removal of indigenous peoples. I've always admired the intentionally unromantic photographs of Robert Adams. He was included in the 1975 photo exhibition, New Topographics, Photographs of a Man-Altered Landscape, and his work challenged this ideology and long-standing myth. Instead of showing how the landscape of the West was impacted by roads and housing developments and drive-in movie theaters like this one. Canadian photographer Edward Bertinsky worked along these same lines, but instead of using what David but instead he uses what David Bate calls contemporary sublime, which evokes these simultaneous feelings of horror, awe, anxiety, and he uses really formal, highly detailed, and beautiful images. It's quite a contrast to those railroad tracks that Watkins shot. Here, instead of being in quiet harmony with the land, they cut through. He even calls this series rail cuts, causing landslides, disrupting the earth. I was also really influenced by John Fall's Altered Landscape series, where he adds marks or materials to an environment before he photographs it, using his gestures to interrupt the picturesque scene and bring the hand of the artist into the image. To me, this starts to get back to Smithson's idea of the open landscape, the subjectivity of the artist making its way into the picturing of the landscape. And a contemporary artist that I look towards is Mary Mattingly, who's actually a PNCA alum, who addresses climate change through her work. I think she's best known for Swale, a barge for growing and distributing food on New York City's rivers. And her recent 2020 show, Pipelands and Permafrost, she hung photographic landscapes like vertical scrolls. Each image is a composite. She stacked 3 or more landscapes on top of one another as a way to show a site's geological timeline and refer to core samples. It's a really different way of depicting the landscape, sort of refuting the single vantage point, showing the complexity of representing landscape. And each image's title includes a dedication. For example, for the image in the middle, which is titled A Controlled Burn, the dedication reads, "For the stewards of traditional ecological knowledge that have worked for generations promoting healthy forest growth with controlled fire application." I love the way Mattingly's work has an optimism embedded inside of its grief, a nod to the small things that we can each do. During the pandemic, I started a series that I call Reticulations when I was homebound with a newborn and a toddler, and I needed something soothing to relieve the sense of panic, dread, and chaos that invaded all of us that year. So I took photos often with my kids during the day, and then I printed them on my inkjet printer at home and wove strips of colored paper into the images at night. So this series is a continuation of my previous work in terms of putting my hand into the work, but I'm simplifying the process. Instead of rephotographing the prints, I make a one-of-a-kind print, this woven photograph. And choosing colors of paper before I start a piece feels a lot like looking through tubes of paint. And then cutting strips is kind of like mixing paint on a palette. Sometimes I work with matching colors within the image so that the squares of paper read almost like an enlarged pixel, reminding of this fabrication of the digital image, a grid of pixels. If you zoom into a photograph in Photoshop, you'll see that it's just a bunch of squares, each one a different color. I find that this physical act of weaving is very meditative and calming. And the patterns I make are really satisfying, so they're bringing an order to chaos. The weaving creates a fabric of papers, which reminds me that the inkjet print is really, after all, just another piece of paper. And the craft of weaving has a long history across a lot of cultures and eras. Women have always had a unique relationship to weaving, so I love the idea that by using this act of weaving, I'm tying a feminine history to this male canonized genre of landscape photography. The images I work with continue this approach of photographing fragments of nature that I encounter in my own front yard or walks along the Oregon coast. And the title, Reticulations, refers to the effect of the surface of the woven print, and also to that technical term, which is really specific, that describes a crackling pattern that can sometimes happen on the emulsion of film during development. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. Another series I'm working on is Regenerations, and here I'm going back to that same challenge I took on earlier of depicting a landscape through the mode of still life. One of the formal choices I made to support this concept is to make only vertical photographs. So this acts as a nod to studio portrait and still life photography, where the use of vertical orientation emphasizes the subject by centralizing it in the composition. But it also subverts expectations of landscape orientation, which I just think is so wild that the horizontal orientation of an image came to be known by the word landscape. So each photo in my process leads to the next. Even if I have a rule to abide by, I make sure to allow for improvisation so I can learn from experiments and mistakes. And I've been exploring working with found materials to add texture to an image. So here I was using cardboard packing material that I had saved and was sitting in my studio for ages to weave strips of a photograph into. And then I wove pieces of grass into the image on top of the photo strips. Here I worked with needlepoint canvas, layering it in front of and behind different sections of the print. And I'm really drawn to textures that create this visual connection to a grid, just like that grid of pixels that I was sort of getting at with my weaving. Very much on my mind lately, as I'm sure on all of yours, is AI-generated images and how those relate to camera-made images, as well as these more handmade images. The title of this series, Regenerations, refers to my process of creating something new, using my human hand to generate something different out of pre-existing images. I learn the most when I make work that I don't know the answer to before I make it, work that isn't resolved or that I can't imagine until I see it as a photograph. And each of my images is continuing the style that I've developed of photographing close-up views of the plants that I walk by in my own front yard or at the edges of sidewalks. And by choosing to photograph this here rather than out there, I'm hoping to embrace a more honest understanding and appreciation for nature as not just something that exists apart from our day-to-day, our urban life. I want to gently dismantle this myth of wilderness and to instead create images that include recognizable aspects of cultivated landscape through my own encounters. In some images, I trim bits of plants or flowers and tuck them into the construction. So this is kind of a kickback to my Real Artifice series when I was positioning apples next to prints of apples. But it also speaks to the immediacy of the subject matter that I can run outside and grab a flower and bring it back into its own representation. I also intentionally leave mistakes. There's a printer error up there in the left corner. And I decided to keep that in the construction as a way to reveal the digital fabrication process. And I think it helps dismantle this illusion of the image as much as any of my cutting actions. So I see all of my own cuts, folds, weaving, everything I do in the studio as a way to bring a final human element to the work, acting as a reminder that the ideas of nature, wilderness, and landscape are as fabricated as the photographs that we see of them. I'm filled with grief, as I'm sure many of you are, by the rapid changes unfolding all around us, warming our planet and setting life as we know it into this uncertain future. And in the end, I just want to take joy in the views that I encounter, finding tenderness in the present, drawing attention to the local and the small things that we can each do. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm up for a few if anyone has any. Yes. If not, that's fine. Melanie.
What are the scale of your images generally? Are they small or large? Like, what is the scale?
When I print the final photos?
Like the final pieces.
I think they vary from series to series. Those weaves, some of them are pretty small because I was doing them on my home inkjet printer during the pandemic. So those were all like 13 by 19, that's my home inkjet printer. But then lately I've scaled them up to be more, I think it's 20 by 30 or 24 by 36. So those have some bigger ones in there too. But usually I like making about 20 by 30 size images prints. Yeah, so you can look at the detail of them. Julia.
Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation, and this is where the virtualness of the nature of slides doesn't really give us a full sense of your work. So hopefully folks, if they haven't already seen your work in person, can see it in different places. But I'm so glad that we have this opportunity for you to go through a number of images. And I was thinking as you were going through your series about the isolation of working in photography, or in general of working in the arts. It's often a very kind of solo pursuit. And I think there's this mythology around photography that a photographer is a single person working alone and charging as best they can through the loneliness and the isolation of the dark room. You work at an art school. And I'm very curious, especially as we lose more specialized places of learning like art schools. Have you thought about how being around emerging artists who use photography, how that may influence you, or have you thought about the support that community gives you, even you as somebody being a leader in that space? Is there a kind of symbiotic relationship that is helpful to you?
Definitely. I think that, being a teacher, you always learn as much from your students as you teach them, if not sometimes more. And I brought up Teju Cole's article, which is an assignment that I came up with that I like to do myself. I always like to do the assignments I give my students, but it's so inspiring to see the work that's being generated by the new generation of artists. I think working in an art school is such a privilege to be able to see that, because it sets you into this instant dialogue with all these fresh thinkers that have such a different perspective, that maybe weren't raised learning photography through the darkroom, that have a different language at their fingertips. So I am very grateful to be exposed to all of that. And I also think that, I wanted to show artists that I consider myself in dialogue with, even though I haven't met a lot of them. I think it's really important as an artist to remember that your work is always in conversation with other people and other artists, and to consider yourself a part of that conversation, that you're not working alone. And social media is wonderful in how it provides us that ability to have conversations and to share so broadly with people that you aspire to know, or that you have artist crushes on. That's an assignment I love to give students. So I definitely think conversation and community is a huge part of being an artist, and it's something I feel so privileged to be a part of.
Hi. I'm a big fan of Teresa. When I was in grad school, you mentored me over the summer. You taught me how to use Photoshop, selective masking, you taught me how to print, you taught me how to document. You're like one of the giants that the shoulders that I think that I stand on. And so hearing this talk and really getting in depth about your research is as always, so inspiring. And I really love the way that you're incorporating, you're really breaking down the photo and creating your own in terms of weaving. And I love how you bring in a fem practice of all of that. So I know a lot of your work is of nature and these moments that I see on social media, because I follow you. I also follow the TikTok, anyways. I'm just wondering, do you, in terms of conceptual material, would you ever bring back that industry or any other types of tension within the work, or are you really happy just working with color and grid and continuing these types of iterations of photography?
That's a good suggestion. Yeah, I know. I had like a series in the middle that in different horizons where I really was bringing in more sort of not what we normally think of as nature in terms of landscape, industrial structures. And I started off with those paintings of industry. So that's actually really fascinating to think about. I just haven't been drawn to photographing that lately, but I hope I do at some point because I do think it's a really immediate way to challenge the landscape. I think right now I'm trying to work with things that we think about as natural elements but might not be the way that a landscape would be depicted, and to sort of challenge it from that perspective. But I still take photos of, you know, nature, industry, relationship to one another. Any other questions? Thank you so much for coming today.